So listen to this. Pretty much every young football fan's dream is to become a superstar footballer. Most would give anything to live that life. But well, Tomás El Trinche Carlovich had the chance to have all of that, and he still rejected every club that approached him just so he could keep on playing for his hometown club in the 3rd division. So, what exactly was wrong with him? We're talking about a guy who proved he was capable of going head-to-head with the likes of AC Milan and the Argentinian national team and still destroy everyone who dared to face him. We're talking about a guy who was so talented and so famous in Argentina that massive crowds would flood the stadiums of minor league clubs just to get a glimpse of him. But now there's nearly no footage left of him playing, just a few clips from when he was already over 40 years old. Besides that, we're just left with stories from everyone who got to see him. And well, let's just say that Carlovich was born in Rosario, the same town as Lionel Messi, and still to this day, it isn't too hard to find old folks insisting that he was more talented than the 7-time Ballon d'Or winner. You go back and ask any Argentina national team coach what they think of him, and they'll have nothing but absolute praise for the man. Passarella said when he was younger he dreamed of being like him. Menotti literally tried to call him up to the national team when he was already 32 years old. Peckerman has been quoted saying he was the most wonderful Argentine player of all time and even named him in his all-time greatest 11. And still, Marcelo Bielsa managed to be even more obsessed with El Trinche than any of those managers. He tried to imitate his dribbles as a kid, even got the same haircut as him, and the most impressive of all, Bielsa himself was one of the people who followed Carlovich across the country. According to him, he never missed a match over a span of 4 years, traveling every Saturday so he could go watch him live. Even the great Maradona loved El Trinche, so much so that when he arrived at Newell's Old Boys, they greeted him as the best player in the world during his presentation, and he interrupted everyone to say, "The greatest of all is already in Rosario. His name is Carlovich." But I know exactly what you're about to ask. What exactly led him to reject all those clubs? Why was he so attached to his hometown? What happened? Well, there was one club he technically didn't reject. When he was 15 years old, he joined Rosario Central, one of the biggest clubs in Argentina. He played in their academy for a few years. Supposedly they even sent him out on loan for a while, but when he was finally afforded a chance at playing for the main team, things derailed rapidly. He played one friendly against Peñarol and was then called up for his first official match, which would be played in Buenos Aires, meaning he would have to travel by bus. But unfortunately, by then, Carlovich was already having second thoughts about his career. He didn't enjoy the bright lights, he didn't like being the center of attention. He was a quiet guy who often would even retreat to a stall to put on his kit, as even being in the locker room overwhelmed him a bit. The football superstar lifestyle was too much and too fast for him. After all, as he has claimed himself, he never meant to become a football player. So, the day of the match, he was so nervous he arrived at the training center 1 hour before any other player. The bus was already parked, so he went in and sat in the back row, quiet and completely involved in his thoughts. 10 minutes later, he left the bus and no one at the club heard from him again. Carlovich had decided this life wasn't a life for him. But over the next 2 decades, the spotlight he so actively tried to avoid would still be put on him over and over again, as the entire country seemed decided on convincing him to give it another try. After moving around for a while trying to figure out where he belonged, he eventually arrived back in Rosario, where he joined not Rosario Central, not Newell's Old Boys, but Central Córdoba in the 3rd division. And not only did that club become home to him, he also began immediately attracting everyone's attention. Known as El Trinche, meaning the fork, because of his long legs, the 6-foot-tall midfielder tended to avoid physical challenges at all costs. He preferred to play in his own way, calmly sitting back and allowing his mind to make up for his sluggishness, either by effortlessly pinging 40-yard passes or through his uncanny, composed dribbling. In fact, this was his most notorious attribute. Some sources still claim to this day that he holds the record for the longest uninterrupted possession ever in the history of Argentine football. Just picture this, it was a really hot day, the sun was nearly unbearable, so he took the ball, dribbled towards the side of the pitch that was in the shade, and then dribbled everyone who tried to get the ball from him for 10 whole minutes, until the referee had to stop the match and ask him to play properly. It was unbelievable, the man even had his own signature move, the double nutmeg. It was so mesmerizing, the crowds would spend whole matches chanting for him to pull one off, and most often he did, sending the ball in between the opponent's legs, waiting for him to try and turn around and putting it through the other way before he even had time to react. However, no matter how good he was on the pitch, it has to be said, Carlovich was an even more interesting character outside of it. You always hear about a player being late to training. Well, Carlovich often failed to even show up for the matches. It was so bad the team bus began swinging over by his house to get him in order to make sure he didn't miss the matches, and still, very often, he would get on the bus, half asleep, in his boxers, not to mention the fact that he never brought a towel, shin pads, well, anything except for his boots. Regardless, as much as all these gimmicks capture the attention of a lot of people, it wouldn't be until he turned 27 years old that he would become a nationwide phenomenon. With only months to go before the 1974 World Cup, Argentina had already qualified and were looking to play some friendlies. So they came up with the idea of playing against a sort of all-star team made up of players from Newell's Old Boys and Rosario Central. But there was a problem. They didn't want to favor either club, so they decided to pick 5 players out of each team and then get the final player from some other club to make up the starting 11. And the moment that was suggested, Carlos Grigol, the Rosario Central manager who had coached Carlovich back when he was younger, jumped out of his seat and said, "Why not take Carlovich, the big guy from Central Córdoba?" And look, they all instantly agreed that it sounded like a lot of fun, but what they didn't expect was that with a young Mario Kempes by his side, Carlovich would have his team winning 2-0 by halftime, shocking everyone who was watching him for the first time, and even managing to pull off his famous double nutmeg against Pancho Sá, who would become one of the most decorated footballers in the history of the Copa Libertadores. Rumor has it that during the halftime break, the national team coach even asked Grigol to sub Carlovich off, but he decided to instead give him 15 more minutes, which was enough for the team to go in front 3-0, with one of Karlovich's teammates claiming to have heard some national team players asking him to take it easy on them. But of course, once he was on the bench, Argentina managed to pull one back, setting the result at a 3-1, which didn't stop the newspapers from spreading this story across the country with the headline, "Carlovich, the one who tore the national team to shreds." The aftermath from this match actually led him to move teams, joining Independiente Rivadavia, but being 500 miles away from home was already far too much for him. He hated it there, so much so that one time he got himself sent off on purpose right before halftime so he could travel back to Rosario for Mother's Day, which might be the most wholesome sending off in the history of the sport, and still not even close to the most absurd thing he did during his time there. You see, by then, Menotti, the national team coach at the time, had been completely fascinated by Carlovich. And with the 1978 World Cup being hosted in Argentina, they had no qualification matches to play, so Menotti felt there was no reason not to risk calling a third division player up to the national team. So he did it. But when the day of the match finally arrived, Carlovich was nowhere to be found. So they left without him, and according to Menotti, by the time he finally got his hands on Carlovich and asked him what happened, he told him he was stranded on an island at the time. Supposedly he had gone fishing, which was this big hobby of his, but then the river flooded, stranding him on his little island, so he just decided to wait it out, missing the match. But the funny thing is, years later they asked him about it, and he said, "I don't remember that, but if Menotti says so, then it probably happened." Which is just hilarious. Still, despite this entire mess, new opportunities kept coming, and in 1977, everyone held their breaths, waiting to see what would happen after Carlovich agreed to join Club Atlético Colón in the Argentine First Division. However, a string of physical problems saw Carlovich be subbed off due to injury in every single one of his first 3 matches, which greatly upset him and led him to return to Rosario, once more leaving the club without even saying anything to them. Regardless, Carlovich then joined another minor third division team, Andes Talleres, and just as he hoped to stay away from the spotlight, everything went wrong. Out of mere coincidence, AC Milan were on tour in South America, and as you might imagine, the Italian champions were undefeated. But of course, to end their tour, they would play Andes Talleres, as supposedly there were a lot of Italian immigrants in the region. AC Milan had Baresi, Capello, and even Ballon d'Or winner Gianni Rivera. It should have been a clean sweep. And in reality, despite going behind early on, they quickly got back on top of the game before the halftime break. However, that's when Carlovich came in, completely taking control of the midfield and sending one through ball after the other, according to a newspaper, giving Baresi a torrid time. By the time the game was done, Carlovich was named the man of the match, Andes Talleres had accomplished the biggest win in their history, and every AC Milan staff member was approaching Carlovich trying to understand who the hell he was and exactly how much money they'd have to pay him for him to move to Italy. But of course, he paid them no attention whatsoever, and when he was asked about his performance, he very nonchalantly said, I didn't score, but I had a little fun. I also have to say this, ironically that was Rivera's last ever match. Some say that it was watching Carlovich that made him want to quit the sport. And well, it does sound like a legend, but at this point, who knows? In fact, at around that time, he was approached with an opportunity to join Boca, where he would have played alongside Maradona, but despite the offer being extremely impressive, he did not even bother looking at the numbers and just replied, "No thank you." And instead, he played out the rest of his professional career at Central Córdoba, the one place where he always seemed to belong. It's just a shame it all ended the way it did, but I'll get to that in a second. First, let me tell you that none of this stopped other clubs from showing up at his house trying to sign him. From Inter to Paris Saint-Germain, you will find the craziest stories, but my favorite one is easily the one with the New York Cosmos, who supposedly wanted him to join their superstar team alongside the likes of Chinaglia, Beckenbauer, and Pelé. But what makes this the most interesting to me is that there are two versions to this story. Some say the idea of signing him came from Pelé, who was told about him by some South American friend he had. But others claim the exact opposite, that the transfer never went through because Pelé boycotted the whole operation, afraid he would be outshined by the mythical Carlovich. Yeah. Regardless, by 1988, at 42 years of age, El Trinche finally hung up his boots. But the moment he put them down, the regrets began settling in as he began to realize there was nothing else he could really do outside of football. That had been his whole life, and now he had nothing to show for it. Sadly, he ended up working as a bricklayer, and every year, he seemed to become more and more nostalgic over his past life. For a while, everyone believed Carlovich was this hero of the people, a pure soul, devoid of any ambition or greed. One who was truly just glad to kick a ball around. But once the osteoporosis took over, he slowly began to lose the light in his eyes. Eventually, a charity match was set up to raise some money for a surgery he needed, and towards the end, a journalist asked him if there was anything he would change about his career, and Carlovich broke everyone's heart, simply replying as his eyes began to water, "No, sir, please don't ask me that. Anything but that, please." The illusion had been broken, and for a long time after that, El Trinche was barely ever seen in public again. But the final piece of heartbreak was yet to come. His last meaningful public appearance would come in 2020 when, despite often avoiding any encounters with celebrities who requested to meet him, claiming he was no good at face-to-face, that year he opened an exception for a special man, Diego Armando Maradona. The moment they saw each other, the two men hugged like long-forgotten brothers. In Carlovich's own words, "He grabbed me, started speaking into my ear, and would not let go. And later, he signed a t-shirt for me and wrote, 'For Trinche, the one who was greater than me.' I didn't know what to say, so I told him, 'Diego, now I can leave this world in peace.'" Months later, Carlovich passed away. He was riding his bike, coincidentally near Central Córdoba Stadium, when a man struck him in the head in an attempt to steal his bike. Carlovich fell to the ground and slipped into a coma. 2 days later, he was pronounced dead. Even in the middle of the pandemic, no one was able to stop the city from mourning its king. A memorial was held in the stadium, and thousands came to pay their respects regardless. In a strange way, it was beautiful to see.